Welcome everybody. It's great that people have come here to celebrate and discuss my colleague, friend and collaborator Kirsten Shepherd-Barr's wonderful new book, Theatre and Evolution from Ibsen to Beckett. A brilliant picture of Fiona Shaw on the front. What we're going to do, I'm chairing, so I'll just say something very briefly. I will then hand over to our panellist. First of all, Michael Billington, who needs no introduction. Everybody will know his wonderful theatre reviews for The Guardian, but I'm going to let the panellists say a little bit about themselves. And then Morten Kringlebach, who's a professor here and a senior research fellow in the Department of Psychiatry, and will say a little bit about his own work, except I cannot forbear telling you that he works on neuroscience and pleasure. Isn't that great? So Kirsten, people will know as Professor of English here at Oxford, and an immensely enabling figure who set up the Ibsen network here and works on literature and science, but particularly theatre and science. And her two previous books, the first book on Ibsen and early modernist theatre, the second one, Science on Stage, from Dr. Faustus to Copenhagen, have really laid the way for her book on theatre and evolution from Ibsen to Beckett. And I think Kirsten is absolutely at the forefront of the expanding field of literature and science, and she's done the sustained work on theatre and drama, which is in many ways, I'm afraid to say, a poor relation in many English departments and English faculties, not least the enormous department at Oxford, where we could really, I think, build up, particularly in the modern period, work on theatre, so important to all aspects of literary study, but also the way it reaches out, as we will be hearing, into other kinds of interdisciplinary field. And is making a major contribution to the work at Oxford on science and literature, the medical humanities, medicine and literature. So Theatre and Evolution from Ibsen to Beckett is a compelling study. It's written with the utmost lucidity. It is an absolute pleasure to read. Complex ideas are presented to you in ways that one can really understand, even if you're outside the field, but there's never any diminution of the richness of the ideas, no simplification of the richness of the ideas. So it gives us a new take on the impact of Darwin on literature, which Gillian Beer, amongst others, made so central to literary study a few decades ago. But not just Darwin, but the whole climate of evolutionary thought in the 19th century. So what the book is asking is, why has evolution been so central in and for theatre? And the compelling argument, I think, central argument, one of the compelling arguments is that evolutionary theory itself contains miniature dramas, and Kirsten leads us to these miniature dramas within the rich, imaginative, as well as scientific world of Charles Darwin. So we're looking at the theatre, the spectacle, the performative in evolutionary theory itself. The other side of that is, of course, evolution as it's represented in the theatre, on the stage. Kirsten is asking us to look at what she calls the raw materials of the stage. She says, our bodies and emotions, not just words in a script. And to take one example of this, she has a wonderful section on the actress Eleanor Duse's blush in relation to Darwin's fascination with the function of blushing in his expression of the emotions, and also about the role of emotion in the theatre. How does an actress, an actor indeed, weep? Do tears pour down their face? I was so interested to see that Mrs. Patrick Campbell did it by blowing her nose, which I quite extraordinarily interesting detail. So we have the body on stage. We're also looking at eugenic plots, the centrality of the family to all theatre. But Kirsten is looking at the complexity of eugenic thought, fitness for breeding in the work of Ibsen and his contemporaries. The book is centrally concerned with gender and sexuality. There's a wonderful chapter on breastfeeding on stage. I don't suppose that many people knew the whole furore around plays which actually represented actresses breastfeeding. And this leads us into questions of censorship in very important ways. Theatre and Evolution involves questions of marriage and maternity, spectacle and performance. And then in the coda, the legacy of the freak show in contemporary theatre, which I find extremely interesting. So we have evolutionary thought not only as theme and narrative structure in drama, but as itself part of theatre's performativity and theatre's relationship to time, duration, change and transformation. There are wonderful discussions of the great playwrights Ibsen, Shaw, Thornton Wilder, Samuel Beckett, many women playwrights, Elizabeth Robbins amongst them, and a host of other dramatists whose work is perhaps less well known than it should be, but that I'm sure this book will do a great deal to bring to the fore to our attention. So, fantastic book, and I'm now going to hand over to Michael Billington, who it's a great honour to have here, to say something more about it in relation to his own work as a theatre critic.
Thank you, Ange. Thank you. Yes, my approach is that of a practicing theatre critic. I would say there are two big problems confronting anyone who writes a book about drama. The first one lies in discovering new territory, because it seems to me most of the fields have been already well ploughed. And the other is avoiding the temptation to treat drama as an enclosed and self-sustaining world. And I would say Kirsten triumphantly avoids both these traps. She's already written a book on science on stage that for me is a landmark. And now with Theatre and Evolution, from Ibsen to Beckett, she traces the impact of Darwinian, post-Darwinian and contrarian ideas on modern drama. And I think the result's absolutely outstanding in two ways. One is it sheds new light on works that are part of the canon, showing how evolutionary ideas about such subjects as sexual selection, motherhood, environmental decay, and total extinction affected all the great dramatists. But she's also, as you indicated a moment ago, unearthed a whole network of neglected writers and forgotten plays that were just as much permeated by the big evolutionary debate. And the only way I can illustrate this is by quoting a few examples. Firstly, the central canon. I mean, Ibsen's plays have now been examined from just about every conceivable angle. But I think Kirsten sheds new light on them by viewing them through the specific perspective of evolution. The Lady from the Sea, with its hydrophiliac heroine, is clearly a play about adaptation, environment, and hybridity. And I found even more fascinating the relation of an enemy of the people to ideas that were current at Ibsen's time. It is perfectly possible to see the hero of that play, and I'm assuming some people know it already, the hero Dr. Stockman, as the man of principle who stands out against the tyranny of the majority. And the tendency in modern drama has been to treat him as a sanctified hero. Arthur Miller did a version of the play that made him exactly that, the man of truth in a world of lies and deceit. But Kirsten also shows how Ibsen, at least temporarily, embraces eugenic views when Stockman talks chillingly about the vermin and the curs that he has been forced to treat as a doctor, and whom he would be happy to see eliminated. As Kirsten says, we have danced gingerly around Ibsen's eugenic views for far too long, and most productions even now tend to cut or dilute or soften Stockman's more intemperate points of view. On the other side, Kirsten goes on to point out Ibsen's prescient environmentalism and his belief in man's need to live in harmony with nature. But I think she illuminates Ibsen by reminding us of his debt to a whole variety of thinkers, from Herbert Spencer to Francis Galton, and his belief, which I'm not sure he ever quite gave up, in an aristocracy of the liberated. There's an uncomfortable side to Ibsen, in other words, which this book addresses in a way most others don't. But Kirsten also takes a later dramatist at the other end of the spectrum, like Beckett, and relates his work to evolutionary ideas. The idea of extinction is explored in the book through the work of Ibsen, Henry James, Thornton Wilder, and other writers. But it becomes a vital key to understanding Beckett. Cyril Connolly once wrote that Beckett is the poet of terminal stages. But Kirsten brilliantly reminds us that extinction isn't just a poetic metaphor or a theatrical device in Beckett's work. It is an accepted reality. Krapp, in Krapp's last tape, speculates that the earth might be uninhabited. Winnie, in Happy Days, talks of Earth, you old extinguisher. And the very title of Endgame in itself implies finality. Yet the paradox of Beckett, of course, is that his characters have this capacity for endurance, which as Kirsten points out, suggests that they themselves are at odds with the earth they inhabit. I could cite lots more examples of how the great canonical figures are illuminated through this book. But I think what the book also does is view modern drama, the whole of modern drama, through the prism of the evolutionary and environmental debate. And what it does especially well is remind us that the debate wasn't just confined to the big names. I was only dimly aware of a whole series of Victorian freak shows which exhibited what were then seen as missing links between animals and humans, or displaced hybrids such as hirsute women. I was also generally astonished, to learn of a late play by Pinero, which I'd never heard of, called The Freaks, written in 1918. And Pinero we think of as this sort of comfortable, well-upholstered dramatist, doing plays that now seem rather comfortable. He writes a play called The Freaks, which put on stage what were called extraordinary mortals, and which tested the audience's prejudiced or stereotypical reaction to these so-called human oddities. And I would long to see someone have the courage to put that play on stage today. But it's fascinating to read Kirsten a whole bunch of less familiar plays. She makes a very strong case for Henry James, I think, and for Guy Domville as a drama about extinction. And I have actually seen that play, and it does work. The myth is that James was a disaster as a dramatist. Not at all. It's a very stageable play. She also tells me about an American dramatist about whom I knew nothing, James Hearn, who consistently puts babies on stage and who dealt, as you said earlier, quite openly with the business of breastfeeding in a way that would shock UKIP and other members today. I was also delighted to read a long section in the book on the American dramatist Susan Glaspell, and in particular on her play The Verge, whose heroine is a plant scientist, and the play itself deals with the nature of motherhood, femininity, and creativity. It just so happens, this is not a plug, but it so happens that I have included The Verge in a book of my own, which I've finished, is coming out soon, called The 101 Greatest Plays. And I thought I had this play to myself, more or less, but then I was delighted to read Kirsten's account of it. And I'm only sorry it's too late for me now to plunder and steal from you and to put all your evolutionary ideas into my own account of the play. But this, in the end, is why this book, I think, is such a breakthrough, because it relates the issues that have dominated the drama of the last 150 years, nature, heredity, sexuality, the environment, to the concurrent debate about evolution. And it seems to me, when I look at my theatre books shelves, only a small handful of books have this capacity to relate drama to the ideas of the time. The other signal example, I would say, is Eric Bentley, who wrote a famous book called The Modern Drama, which actually relates the growth of the modern movement to current ideas. And it's a book I go back to time and time again. And I know, in fact, the same will be true. I go back to Kirsten's book on science and theatre because there is nothing to parallel it. And I will go back to this new book again, I think, repeatedly, because it contains new information for me and sees familiar plays in a new light. So, I can talk about the book in more detail, but I would like to give it my ringing and enthusiastic endorsement. Thank you very much.
Can I just say thank you to you both so much? Now you know what you have to do, Morten.
It's the role of the scientist, right? Well, first of all, I should sort of just add my own voice to this. I think it's a scholarly and highly enjoyable book. And for somebody who makes pleasure his business, I think I know what I'm talking about. So what is it that I do, and how does it link with this book? So I've become very interested in why we do the things we do. What is it about our brains that makes us do things? And it turns out that evolution, of course, is absolutely central to this. Because, of course, in order to survive, which is what we have to do as a species and as individuals, we have to have certain things out there that we pay special attention to. And of course, in order to survive as an individual, we need to be looking out for food and have some enjoyment with that so that we keep coming back to it. In order to survive as a species, we need to be able to have other conspecifics out there and have sex with them. And of course, we need to have other conspecifics. We are a very social species. So those three things are really the important things in life. Those are the sort of the things that our evolution built our brain to do. At the same time, if you look at the way that pleasure comes, now most of us will have had a bit of food now, so we are sort of in the postprandial phase. But of course, we still got room for that chocolate dessert. So at the moment I'm wanting a chocolate dessert, unfortunately there wasn't any chocolate dessert. At some point I might be able to get, maybe from Maison Blanc, I may be able to get some chocolate dessert, and then I go into what we call the liking phase, and something else happens in my brain. My brain goes in a phase transition from one state to another. And then once I've had that chocolate cake, I probably won't have any more, maybe a coffee, but I certainly don't have to think about food for some time. So in other words, the way that we consume, the way we engage with pleasures are cyclical. And in many ways, if you look at that cyclical thing, and it happens for all of the pleasures, it's very much the same kind of cycles that we see on stage. It's very much the same kind of cycles that we use when we tell stories. And of course, this is what anybody involved with storytelling, whether in books or whether on the stage, will know very well. And I think one of the interesting things, of course, is when you then try to take these evolutionary stories and try to bring them on stage, to get people to think about what it actually means to have these constraints and to try to liberate ourselves from those constraints. It also means, just in terms of what happens in our brains, when I then stick people into scanners, I am able to see how it is that different parts of your brain are active at different times. And of course, when you're wanting something, it's very different from when you are liking something, and it's very different from you can't have any more. And just understanding that whole kind of cycle turns out to be crucial to understanding what happens when something goes wrong, when people become mentally ill. And trying to rebalance that system, making sure that they can make those phase transitions, that they can finish their story, if you like, for each of these pleasures, turns out to be one way to think about how we might be able to come up with new ways of dealing with mental illness. So I have previously tried to engage with this both in sculpture with Annie Cattrall, but also in thinking about dance, trying to see how as a scientist I can bring these new insights, and of course they're not really new. I mean, you don't need me to tell you that food and sex and other people are important, or that maybe the same kind of brains are involved, same parts of the brains are involved in liking them. But how do I engage with them, and how does that then make me think about things like addiction, where clearly what happens is that we engage with something truly pleasurable, and we re-engage with it so much that it's no longer pleasurable, but we can't help wanting it all the time. We all keep returning to the paraphernalia. How, if I was to work with somebody who was a storyteller, how would I do that? And so one of the great things about your book is that you have shown how people have grappled with that over time. And I think we've already heard a few examples of the ways in which they've grappled with them, but two things sort of stood out, and two things connect very, very strongly to my research. The first thing is this stuff about reproduction. So in Oxford it's quite difficult to do any kind of study on sex. So in order to do that I had to ally myself with the Dutch. They can have sex in scanners, usually just one at a time. But it means that you can start to understand how it is that sexuality functions. Now, as we are peering into the brains of people, we see something that is borne out in the plays. Namely that, first of all, that there are no real differences between men and women in terms of their brains. If I was to take out a brain and put it on the table, none of my colleagues would be able to tell whether it was a female or a male brain. They may be able to say that because it was rather large, it's more likely that it was a male brain because men on average is larger than women. But there's no gross difference between men and women. But of course, one of the things that is very different is what happens to female sexuality. And of course, a lot of plays is about controlling female sexuality. And Darwin himself was aware that there was an abnormality in the human species, in that in most other species is actually the female of the species that selects the men based on their attributes. And of course, what tends to happen in humans is the other way around. But that really is an abnormality. And at the same time, there's something really, really powerful about female sexuality that means that we feel that we have to control it at all times. And then eventually, of course, there will be babies. And part of my research is trying to understand how it is that what happens, as I say, the other people are really important. And trying to understand how it is that we engage with other people. The template for that, of course, is in the parent-infant relationship. Now, if something goes wrong with that, if you have a mother or father who's postnatally depressed, which happens to about 10 and 15%, both men and women, then that baby, if left untreated, is much more likely to develop psychiatric problems later on, which is, of course, very difficult, and we're trying to find ways in which we can help with that. But of course, it was illuminating to then look at what it was that you were talking about, the breastfeeding on stage, to start to think about what is a maternal instinct, and to be drawn back to the debates that have raged throughout the centuries, coming into, as you talk about, the wet nurses, thinking about how it is that lending your breast could be seen as an altruistic process, but of course it could also be a very different kind of process that happened in France, where wet nurses would be drawn to the capital and leave their own babies behind. And so, of course, you are then situating the dramas that are put on stage as a reflection not just of evolution as a scientific process, but also as a way of starting to think about how that should influence science, how it should influence society in general. And I think that is probably one of the most important things about drama, is when you make that link, when you make the link between the science, between society, and with the people that inhabit that society. And in many ways, of course, that's where I would like to take it next. I would like to think about what it really means to collaborate as a scientist with an artist. What about, so many times when I, as a scientist, try to talk to people, it is often thought that science have a sort of a different relationship to the truth. All the kind of doubts, all the explorations that we're constantly undergoing are usually lost. You end up with this result that you then try to depict in some way on stage or as a part of a story, but all the mishaps that happen along the way, and all the problems of, is it really true what I found? Can I really question myself, or will this idea in fact take me over? Will it become a meme and I just become the carrier of this idea? So in that vein, there's a book from 1941 called Log from the Sea of Cortez, which is a collaboration between John Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts, who was a marine biologist. And I know that you're also very interested in this book, and it's one of my favorite books because it's one of those books where you can really see a dialogue, a constant exploration of what it means to actually tell stories, to actually be human, to think about what the human condition is. And it's a powerful book because you can see that it's not Ed Ricketts being the scientist, and it's not John Steinbeck being the novelist. They're constantly reversing, and also the way the book is written, of course, where you can't really tell who's writing what, means that it becomes a really interesting way of engaging with big ideas. And in many ways, of course, this is why we tell stories, is for us to reflect upon those ideas and think about how they change us. Now, in this book, John Steinbeck or Ed Ricketts is not entirely clear. The prose is more like John Steinbeck, and I think he certainly has taken credit for it. In a later book after Ricketts died, he sort of wrote another version of it. But he talks about this tragic miracle of consciousness. And it's something that has stuck with me because, of course, that is true. We are prediction machines. We are people that try to predict what's going to happen next. And that's what makes us so successful. We are able to think about the past and then change the future to our liking, or at least we believe so. Of course, a lot of drama is about whether we can do that or not, whether the muses allows us to do that. Greek drama being a prime example of that. But it is interesting, this idea of the tragic miracle of consciousness, because of course it rings a bell. If I'm constantly worrying about a past that I can't do anything about, and worrying about a future that I have no hand in, what about the now that we are here? What about the long now that we are right now? So, in many ways, that is the human condition. And I think a lot of theatre, a lot of storytelling is about coming to terms with that, trying to understand what kind of people we are, trying to see whether we can, in fact, allow ourselves to enjoy that long now that we are. And I think one of the great virtues of your book is that it's exactly what it does. In each of the chapters, examining from a different angle large and important questions, it makes us think about what it means to be human. And hopefully, and of course there are no answers, but hopefully it will allow ourselves to see ourselves from new angles. So thank you.
Thank you, Morten. I don't know what to say. I'm completely overwhelmed with gratitude at these comments and just the ideas that you've brought forth in responding to the book, we could have a whole discussion about each one. I mean, one of the things that I know Michael and I share very greatly is this feeling about the playwright and the incredible importance of plays. And it might seem obvious. I have written so much about plays. And trying to understand how the ideas of plays get disseminated. And of course, there's a readership, but there's also performance. And so one of the things I've tried to do is address how that works. And often for plays that might only have existed as texts, maybe they're only in little hand-printed versions in the British Library. They're not accessible. But also for plays that have had a wide, like Ibsen's plays or Beckett's plays. So it's been very tricky to find a kind of balance in discussing such different entities in the book, different kinds of dramas. But at the core, I guess, is the play. So that script. And I would love it if someone would come along and just put these plays on now, because a lot of them are really unusual. I'm thinking of certain plays like The Mollusk, which nobody would ever have heard of, I'm sure, but it was a 1903 play that had, the central idea was that the female character was a mollusk, so kind of like this barnacle clinging to a rock, and everything around her was kind of happening, and she was perceived as stubbornly not engaging with anything and just being lazy and being static. But of course, if you think about what mollusks actually do, they're deeply engaged in their physiological processes of life, and you don't see it, but it's happening beneath the surface. So that interesting element also comes up of what's visible, and of course audiences only see what they see, but also then what can't be shown, what is going on underneath. And that's been fascinating in terms of thinking about drama as a genre to write about in that dual way. What are you seeing, but also what is the text possibly alluding to? But in that vein, I was thinking about when you brought up about the blush, because that really fascinated me about Douce's unbelievable ability to blush and pale at will. So she didn't just blush. I mean, Shaw really picked up on this idea that she blushed, and he was very impressed, but she also went pale like that. And people, not just Shaw, commented on that. And I was going to ask Morten, when we now do research, there's a lot of research on what happens when you watch somebody doing an action, and there's interest in mirror neurons. And I wondered if that might be something that would come up, because that is one way people have tried to understand what actors actually do, and the kind of reciprocal engagement between an audience and what's going on stage, but also in terms of the larger issue of what happens when we look at each other, and how mirror neurons actually could be part of that, the explanation for empathy. So it's just to say that I'm glad you brought up the issue of acting, because that is the other part of this story, really, is the actor's art, and the idea of Mrs. Patrick Campbell not displaying emotion, but displaying it through its suppression. That's a really key feature of what women do on the stage around, starting in the kind of 1890s. The histrionics sort of vanish, and it's about showing through minimal expression of emotion, actually just gestures like the blowing of the nose, or in Hedda Gabler, she walks across the stage and raises her fists, but there's no verbal expression of her frustration. But I mean, I'm not sure what I could go on and on. The problem is, you have to cut me off.
It's a really interesting question. It's very clear that from earlier on there's very strong urge to mimic. I mean, they've done studies where you show your face to a newborn baby, and if you are close enough, the baby will mimic your facial expressions. It's also very clear from work with postnatally depressed mothers that if you have a still face, if you just keep your face absolutely still to the baby gets very, very upset, because there's no communication, there's no mimicry, there's not a lot of things going on there. Now, I've been fascinated by this work and what it tells us about emotions. And I think actors are a really interesting species to study. Because, of course, most actors will tell you that they become a mask. They will tell you that they have to come up with all these tricks in order to show, to mimic an emotion, but they can't allow themselves to fully inhabit that emotion, because if they do that, they tend to forget the play. They tend to then come at it at the wrong way. And so I think there's a really interesting question. Can you show all the outward signs of emotions without actually inhabiting that emotion? And I think the answer to that is yes, you can. Even the smallest of unusual thing like a Duchenne smile, where you actually, it's the wrinkles of your eyes that shows that you have a real smile. You can, as an actor, learn to at least mimic in a way that most of us would take that for a real, genuine smile.
Yeah.
So again, I think there's something really interesting about representation and about what actually goes on behind the mask, as it were.
And actually, this idea of the mollusk also is basically, if you think about it, that's one of the issues around the actor being on stage in the first place. In other words, what I think attracted me so much to the idea of theater and evolution was the way in which automatically, by default, you have evolutionary processes going on before your eyes because of the liveness of theater. And so you have an actor positioned on the stage that always foregrounds the body. The body is the repository of all these physiological processes. It's an ongoing thing we all share. And so whether or not you set it against a backdrop of obvious natural landscape signifying evolution, it's still evolutionary. There's still this constant movement. And in a way that you have to get perhaps in a different way through narrative if you're reading a Thomas Hardy novel or a George Eliot novel. But having the actor, I think, signifying that is a very strong presence.
Can I just pick up on that, what you just said? Because what fascinates me is cultural differences come into play, don't they? Because I'm not an actor, but I've watched a lot of actors. And I mean, culturally, in America, for example, the acting tradition is one based on Russian theories of Stanislavski, that the actor relies on some conscious memory of his or her past. And that, you inhabit the character and you think of your own emotional response to a situation. In other words, you become the character, to put it bluntly. Whereas the British tradition is very different, it seems to me. The British tradition is much more one of representation. Mm. And there were notorious stories of actors in Britain being sort of detached from what they're actually doing. Laurence Olivier in moments of high emotion, turning in Titus Andronicus to one of his actors. He was in Zagreb and he was experiencing, unutterable pain and anguish of Titus Andronicus, and turned to a fellow actor and said, "Have you heard that bastard Donald Wolfit's got a knighthood?" So, in different cultures, different ways of recalling emotion or representing emotion.
And actually,
he did it to spur himself on. It was that was giving him the pain.
And isn't there also a difference? I mean, you learn as an actor in some really basic way that the thing you're looking for, whether you're a spear carrier or Julius Caesar, you want something in each scene, and it's about that being the driver. You have to identify, what do I want? I'm not just standing here carrying the spear. I have some motive for standing here, and so your job as an actor is to determine what is it you want in each scene, and that in a really basic way that feeds into what you were talking about, Morten, in terms of you wanted that piece of chocolate cake. There's a basic common thread in terms of evolutionary needs and wants.
What's your motivation, as actors always say? Yes.
Yeah, what's your motivation? Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I thought I'd throw in that didn't quite come up yet, and I wondered what people thought, is the way in which a lot of these plays or theater generally deals so fundamentally with the family. Because the family as the kind of constellation, the unit of evolution, comes up again and again in these kinds of dramas I've been looking at, whether it's an Ibsen play or a dysfunctional family, as in many Beckett plays, or a complete lack of that sort of nuclear family. But the questioning of motherhood really, in a lot of these plays, does throw that in the air. It really rips it apart in a lot of these plays. So that was something that really fascinated me, and I was trying to map that onto a kind of intellectual discourse around, and social discourse around that. Very much drawing on Sally's work as well, Sally Shuttleworth. But so that is why the breastfeeding is in there. And the breastfeeding, just a quick word about that, is there's only one instance. I'm constantly going around asking people, do you know of any other plays where there's breastfeeding on stage? But it would be great to find that. But it was a really interesting way. The comment I want to make about that was that I think what Hearn was up to was, there were many things he was doing, but one of them was that if you look at what Darwin says about maternal love in Descent of Man, he says that you can't actually see it. It's not something that he has been able to see demonstrated in facial expression. So it's a strange thing, this powerful emotion. Actually, how do you render it? Something that springs to mind is, let's say, a painting where you've got a woman looking into a crib. I mean, that sort of kind of iconic impressionist painting. But what is actually signifying the maternal love? It's the crib that's there. Otherwise, the expression could be any one of several emotions. So the way that the breastfeeding signifies maternal love is it's powerfully done in that play, Margaret Fleming.
But parallel to maternal love, and you dwell on this in the book, is infanticide. The long history of infanticide in drama, actually, particularly in this period. There's a Tolstoy play, which I didn't mention, The Power of Darkness, where it comes in very powerfully, and it goes right into modern drama, doesn't it, up to the infanticide of Fred Ginger to Edward Bond's play, Saved, and so forth.
That's right.
And it's this somehow strange urge to see the mimetic representation of the ultimate nightmare.
Yes. I mean, that's a whole other... I'd love to have that be another project at some point, because I found much more material than I could fit into the book. There was a 19th century fascination with infanticide on stage.
Yeah.
But they sort of... There was a lot of... there were plays in which it was carefully constructed so that the audience, there was a tease going on, so they thought she had done it, but in the end she hadn't actually done it. And so that was an interesting kind of way of vicariously kind of thinking, oh, what would it be like? And then, well, it's okay, all is well. But I think the flirtation with infanticide is very real in a lot of these. What is that saying about the culture?
That's interesting. I mean, Jo McDonough's looked at the infanticide question, but much more in relation to the novel, where she's giving it many more political resonances, whereas I think the questions you're raising would actually raise rather different questions from that political staging that she's talking about.